We're back with Dr. Micky Tripathi at the MedHealth Summit, and these interviews put together by Meeting of the Minds, Wobot Health, and Intubing's MedTech Crossroads. Thank you for taking so much time today, Dr. Tripathi, to talk about these things. When we were at the keynote Q&A, we didn't get to all of our questions, so we're just going to try to touch 2 more of those because the audience had so many cool questions to ask.
Okay, great.
But beforehand, you and I were chatting about this whole world of electronic health records, and then the world that I'm very familiar with of medical devices, especially software as a medical device, and sort of never the twain shall meet, but maybe now they're kind of crashing together, because as we've bumped into many people who sometimes will even complain, they'll say, well, the electronic health records, they kind of get a pass, they can do medical device type things inside of their sort of sacrosanct niche, but we have to get cleared as medical devices. And what you were telling me earlier was maybe that's not always true. There have been some notable cases where the electronic health records are now going through some of that same scrutiny, and those worlds are kind of merging. Tell us just a little bit more about that and how it links with the world of interoperability.
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of table setting. So I think, as you know, hopefully is fairly well known, the FDA has had long-standing regulations related to the approval of medical devices, and software in a medical device and software as a medical device are a key part of that. And now I think that they have approved almost 700 software as a medical device solutions. So those are basically,
you missed it. It was 500 last I knew.
So yeah, so I think it's like 690 something at last count. So they've probably crossed 700 at this point, since I don't check it every day. And those are AI-enabled tools, basically, right? They're AI-enabled software products that qualify as medical devices, and therefore, are getting that approval. So they're hard at work. The vast majority of those, I think, are in the radiology space and in the imaging space. Radiology, dermatology, a little bit of cardiology, I guess, but it's mostly about imaging. And so, but we'll start to see that expand. I think we'll see the volume of applications expand, as well as the scope of those applications. And so ONC, so that's FDA as a partner agency to us. So we're colleagues, and I certainly don't speak for FDA, but we work very closely together. And ONC just published regulations related to the use of AI-enabled products in electronic health record systems. And as you pointed out, the 21st Century Cures Act drew a line where it basically said ONC is responsible for electronic health records from a regulatory perspective, and the FDA is not allowed to enter that space. And FDA is responsible for medical devices, and ONC doesn't enter that space, right? I mean, that was basically sort of the line the 21st Century Cures Act drew. Now, as you point out, some of these are starting to get a little blended here. So how do we think about those? If I've got a medical device, software as a medical device, AI-enabled tool in an electronic health record product, well, how do those regulatory authorities, sort of work together? So here's, we work in very close collaboration with the FDA. And the way I like to think about our regulatory approaches complementing each other, because we, worked long and hard with the FDA as we were writing our regulation, as they continue on their regulatory path. And we're working with the Office of Civil Rights, who also has a stake in this, because they, with regulations such as what's called Section 1557, which is non-discrimination, they, in their draft rule, have said that, well, algorithms, clinical algorithms, are also your responsibility, provider, as it relates to non-discrimination. So it was more a reminder that just because you don't know what's going on in an AI-enabled tool doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to make sure it's not discriminatory.
And that gets you to some of those demographic questions that I know FDA has had to wrestle with a lot.
Yeah, so we've been working closely with OCR, and us, ONC, and FDA on making sure that we're all aligned in sort of how we're thinking about this. So the way I like to think about FDA and ONC regulations is, FDA regulations are kind of a foot wide and a mile deep. And the reason I say that is if you have to first meet the criteria for what's a medical device, right? And that's on the FDA, regulatory, requirements of, here's what it means to be a device.
Participates in the diagnosis of a disease, state, or condition. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Whether it's hardware or software. All right. If you meet device and this is an important and you're going to be commercially marketed. Right. If you meet those 2 criteria, now you're in FDA land, and FDA approval is required in order for you to market your product in the US, right? So that's a yes/no as well, right? The important construct, foot wide, mile deep, and you got to meet those things. And then it's a yes/no. ONC's regulation is sort of the transpose of that. It's a foot deep and a mile wide.
Mile wide, yeah. Okay.
So it's a transpose. So the mile wide is that our regulation requires that any AI-enabled tool, it really cover any AI-enabled tool in an electronic health record, And that's whether it's administrative or what might be thought of as clinical, and whether it meets the definition of a medical device or not. We're agnostic. We have a definition that talks about it being a technology that draws inferences from underlying patient population or training data, and then makes predictions about a particular patient for a particular decision, right? And so it covers all of those, but it's only a foot deep because all it requires is transparency.
What are you doing
About the
under the
AI-enabled
hood?
tool.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what AI-enabled tools are here? All right, here are the 6 AI-enabled tools that iEpic or iCerner have made a part of my product. And then here is some information. We require 31 data elements that are like a model card for those in the industry, a nutrition label for those who aren't in the industry, that gives some information about the AI-enabled product. Not intellectual property, not explainability, because as we know, things like large language models, you don't really know exactly how they came to the conclusion they did. Where the data, where did the model come from? When was it trained? What was the training data set? What are the demographics of the training data set? Has it had any external validation whatsoever? And those aren't, approval, disapproval. Our approach is just to say, make that available to the hospital, to the doctor, so that they themselves
So that you've got
can
some
determine,
transparency and
right,
make a decision.
Exactly, just like they
based
do.
on it.
They determine formularies every day based on a set of criteria. It's like, why not allow them to do that with with these regulations?
And this seems to be the kind of thing in the world of software, because as we're deep into 62304 and things like that, you find yourselves saying, well, I got to break it down to units and I got to integrate it and I got to test it. But how deep you go, it's kind of up to the individual.
Right. Maybe some industry conventions will come around about this. Like, what is an appropriate performance measure for this type of, AI-enabled tool? How do I measure health equity bias? In more standardized ways. What we've done is we've left those fields open. We've said, you should say something about that, but the industry hasn't yet come to a consensus on what's the best way to measure that. So we don't want to get out ahead of the industry on that and leave a lot of room for, for sort of innovation in that area.
Yeah. I've only got you for another 60 seconds.
Yep.
Generative AI, since we're on the topic of artificial intelligence and machine learning. When are we going to get any kind of a breakthrough on that? There's some real challenges that you and I have discussed earlier today about that. What's your take on generative AI?
Yeah, I think, so at least in the O&C regulation, we don't distinguish generative from non-generative because our focus is on transparency, right? So it's just say what you know about this and then let the user decide whether they want to use it or not based on whatever risks they may feel would be, sort of on their lap or in their lap if they were to use the product. I know we're working hard with the FDA as they kind of think about, sort of the future approach here. I think, it's safe to say that there are a couple of things. One is we want to be able to have an approach for industry-wide quality assurance of products. And the FDA, and as a part of the overall HSS strategy, is looking hard at how we think about quality assurances, which is a public and private thing. Are there standardized metrics? Is there infrastructure, both public and private, we want to make available that's aligned with certain standardized metrics that will allow people to say, all right, I've tested my model against this. It's now got the Good Housekeeping seal, and provider A, you should be comfortable using it. And by the way, that might be a part of the transparency, right? You can enter that in the transparency, and maybe that's a market differentiator for you against other products.
Because we can prove something.
Because it proves something, right? You can say, hey, I got it assured at that lab or whatever it is. So that's one part of it. They are also, I think, looking at, because the idea of generative AI in its nature, if you're going to be thinking about that from an oversight perspective, you have to be thinking about post-market surveillance in some way. It's once it's in the field, how is it performing? How has it changed? And now, what do we think about that?
And that's
right?
been one of the big focuses.
Dynamic.
They change once you put them
And right
out
now,
there.
there are pretty limited authorities and capabilities that the FDA has on the post-market surveillance side. So I know they're giving a lot of hard thought to that. We are as well, in supporting them. So I think there'll be more to come, as we think about that. But,
Well, that's exciting. It sounds like ONC's structure and framework of transparency allows you to be a little bit agnostic as to how much evidence needs to be provided and simply to try to provide that to the clinician.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Dr. Micky Tripathi, thank you for being here at the MedHealth Summit and being on the show.